In 1957, police entered a quiet farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin, and found a scene so disturbing that some evidence was locked away for decades. One object, in particular, was hidden from the public eye. To understand why, we must go back to where the nightmare began. Before we start, viewers' discretion is advised. Long before Ed Gein's name echoed through true crime history, there was Plainfield, a remote, wind-swept farming community in central Wisconsin. In the early 1900s, this place was more than just isolated. It was practically cut off from the wider world. Winters stretched endlessly. Families lived miles apart, bound together by shared labor, church, and an unspoken agreement to mind their own business. Outsiders rarely came. Outsiders rarely asked questions. It was in this quiet landscape that the Gein family built their life. George Gein, the father, struggled with alcoholism and held little influence at home. Augusta, the matriarch, ruled the household with rigid religious intensity. She preached fire, brimstone, and moral decay, condemning nearly everyone outside their walls as sinful. To her, Plainfield wasn't a sanctuary. It was a battlefield between good and evil. The family's farmhouse stood on nearly 200 acres of land. It was a fortress of isolation. There was no electricity at first, no nearby neighbors. Inside those walls, Augusta shaped her children's worldview with relentless sermons and harsh discipline. She didn't simply raise sons, she molded believers. Ed absorbed every word. For him, the outside world wasn't just distant, it was dangerous and ultimately unworthy of trust. Edward Theodore Gein was born in 1906. From the beginning, he was small, shy, and sickly, often the target of teasing at school. Classmates noticed his odd mannerisms, vacant stare, and nervous laugh. Teachers remembered a boy who kept to himself and rushed home each day to avoid after-school socializing. At home, Augusta reinforced her worldview daily. She read the Bible aloud for hours, especially passages about sin, punishment, and the corrupting influence of women. She discouraged friendships, forbade Ed and his brother Henry from bringing anyone to the house, and drilled into them the belief that salvation could only be found through strict obedience to her teaching. Ed's attachment to his mother grew intense. While other children explored or formed friendships, he stayed home, listening to her. Over time, he began to develop unusual interests. He showed fascination with anatomy books and stories of adventure and danger, often reading by lantern light in the empty farmhouse. He attended local funerals not out of mourning, but out of quiet curiosity about the rituals of death. Around this time, Ed also began collecting things in secret, items that hinted at an unusual preoccupation with mortality and identity. Decades later, police would find the evidence of this private world hidden deep within the farmhouse. It was the beginning of a pattern that would shape his future in chilling ways. Ed's father died in 1940, leaving the family's land and dwindling resources in the hands of Augusta and her son. Not long after, tragedy struck again. In 1944, Henry Gein was found dead during a marsh fire near the family property. Officially, his death was ruled accidental, but investigators quietly noted inconsistency, bruises on his head, and the way Ed seemed to lead authorities directly to the body without hesitation. The incident raised eyebrows, but in a community that preferred silence, the matter was quickly closed. The final blow came in 1945, when Augusta suffered a stroke and died shortly thereafter. Ed was devastated. His mother had been his guide, his authority, and the center of his world. With her gone, he was left completely alone on the family farm. Instead of changing the house, he preserved her rooms exactly as she'd left them, shutting them off from dust and decay like a private shrine. The rest of the farmhouse began to crumble, rooms filled with junk, newspapers, and scraps. Ed drifted into odd jobs around Plainfield, handyman work, babysitting for neighbors, anything that kept him afloat but didn't demand social interaction. His isolation deepened. It was during these years of silence, in the hollow echo of his mother's absence, that Ed's private obsessions intensified. What began as quiet fixations would soon evolve into something far more sinister. Plainfield had no idea that behind the closed doors of that farmhouse, a new and terrible chapter was beginning. In the years following his mother's death, Ed Gein's world narrowed to the farmhouse and the Plainfield community that barely noticed him. By day, he took odd jobs. By night, he wandered the local cemeteries. His visits weren't random. He pored over obituaries, marking the names of recently deceased women who resembled his mother in age and appearance. These quiet midnight trips became a ritual. When questioned years later, Ed described entering a trance-like state during these excursions. Under cover of darkness, he would visit freshly dug graves. Local cemeteries were small, unguarded, and rural. Few imagined imagined anyone would disturb them. But Ed wasn't interested in vandalism. He was searching for a way to bring parts of the past back into his isolated home. Over time, his farmhouse filled with macabre trophies, carefully hidden away from visitors. Investigators would later describe the interior as a strange mixture of decay and deliberate arrangement. Filthy living spaces alongside rooms that were treated with a near-religious sense of preservation. This period became known as Ed's graveyard years. Official records later confirmed that several graves in Plainfield Cemetery had been disturbed, their contents missing. The community initially refused to believe that one of their own could be responsible. But as evidence mounted, it became clear that Ed had been living in two worlds: the public, quiet handyman, and the secret collector of the dead. And somewhere inside that house, among these disturbing artifacts, there was one item that investigators chose to withhold from the public entirely. For years, Ed's graveyard activities went unnoticed, but eventually, that secret life began to escalate. In 1954, Mary Hogan, a well-known local tavern owner, suddenly vanished. Her tavern was found empty, with only traces left behind. At the time, no one connected the disappearance to Ed. People in town even joked about it. Ed, in his awkward way, once told a neighbor that Mary was down at the house right now. Most assumed he was joking. He wasn't. 3 years later, on November 16, 1957, Plainfield experienced its turning point. Bernice Warden, who ran the town's hardware store, disappeared during opening hours. A receipt for antifreeze, written in her handwriting, was the last recorded transaction, and the name on that receipt was Ed Gein. Sheriff's deputies moved quickly. Hunting season had emptied the town's streets, but Ed's reputation as a harmless loner made him an easy person to approach. That evening, officers visited his farmhouse. What they found would forever change how the world saw small-town America. Bernice's disappearance marked the transition from isolated hidden acts to overt violence that could no longer be ignored. Unlike the silent graveyards, this time there was a direct link, a paper trail leading straight to Ed's door. Investigators expected a routine questioning. Instead, they stumbled into one of the most shocking discoveries in American criminal history, and locked somewhere inside that house was the mysterious object that had eluded public description for decades. When officers entered the Gein farmhouse that cold November night, they expected clutter and perhaps evidence of Bernice Warden's whereabouts. What they encountered was far beyond their imagination. The air was stale and cold. There was no working heat. Newspapers and scraps covered the floors. Furniture sat in strange arrangements. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that this was not an ordinary crime scene. In an outbuilding on the property, they found Bernice Warden's remains. Inside the house, they uncovered an assortment of human remains that defied easy explanation. Household objects fashioned from body parts, clothing stitched together with disturbing precision, masks preserved with unsettling care. Law enforcement officers, many of whom had never dealt with a major criminal case before, were confronted with evidence that required outside investigators and state support to process. Word of the discovery spread through Plainfield almost immediately, but the full extent of what officers saw remained partially hidden from public view. Reporters descended on the town, but many details were sealed in official reports, some not released until decades later. Among these details was a single object found wrapped and stored away that investigators decided not to display, photograph, or describe in detail. Its nature was considered too disturbing for public disclosure at the time. As evidence piled up, Ed Gein was arrested without resistance. In interviews, he seemed oddly calm, almost detached, describing his actions with the same tone one might use to talk about daily chores. The community that had ignored the quiet man on the edge of town suddenly realized that something unimaginable had been growing in its midst. After his arrest, Ed Gein became the focus of intense psychological scrutiny. Investigators and psychiatrists alike wanted to understand how a quiet, unassuming handyman could harbor such disturbing obsession. During interrogations, Ed was cooperative, even conversational, speaking about his activities as though recounting memories rather than crime. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with schizophrenia and described him as having a deeply fractured sense of identity. His attachment to his mother had shaped nearly every decision in his adult life. With Augusta gone, Ed attempted to recreate aspects of her through rituals, collecting remains of women who resembled her, and fashioning objects that reflected his distorted memories and beliefs. One of the most striking revelations revelations during these evaluations was his stated goal of becoming a version of his mother through the use of these collected materials. He described entering trance states, during which he felt compelled to act as though under outside influence. While many details were later sensationalized in films and media, psychiatric records paint a picture of a man whose isolation, trauma, and untreated mental illness led to an alternate world inside his mind. Throughout these sessions, references were made to one particular object, carefully constructed and significant to Ed's personal ritual, that investigators never fully described in public reports. For decades, this item remained a rumor among locals and law enforcement. It represented the most personal, revealing piece of evidence in the case, and it would take years before its true nature became more widely known. For decades, the official files on Ed Gein were partially sealed. Much of what the public came to know came through newspaper sensationalism or films inspired by his crimes, not through the actual evidence. But buried in investigative reports and private recollections of officers was the mention of a single item discovered in his house that was not catalogued for public release. It was kept separate, wrapped in burlap, and shown only to a few investigators. This object wasn't part of the crude household decorations or clothing. It was more deliberate, more intimate, an artifact that spoke to Ed's psychological state rather than his physical acts. Years later, some retired officers described it in interviews with historical crime researchers. It was crafted with care, designed to be worn, and was central to the personal rituals Ed performed alone in the farmhouse. Unlike the items that were eventually exhibited during trial preparation, this object was considered too revealing of his inner life to become a public spectacle. When the truth surfaced through archival digging and first-hand accounts, it clarified a chilling aspect of Ed's motives. He wasn't only preserving fragments of others, he was attempting to construct an alternate identity rooted in his mother's image. This object was the centerpiece of that identity, a private tool in his effort to transform himself within the solitude of his home. This revelation reframed the case. Ed Gein wasn't simply an opportunistic grave robber or killer. He was engaged in a deeply personal, delusional project. What police uncovered wasn't just evidence of crimes. It was evidence of a psyche trying to rebuild its own world, piece by piece, in isolation. Ed Gein was declared legally insane and committed to Central State Hospital in Wisconsin, where he remained for the rest of his life. He died in 1984, decades after his crimes had permanently altered American culture. His trial never became a sensational courtroom drama. Instead, it unfolded in clinical tones, with psychiatric testimony and quiet legal proceedings. Yet the shockwaves of his actions spread far beyond Plainfield. Writers and filmmakers drew on elements of his case to create some of the most enduring figures in horror fiction. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Each took fragments of his story, his isolation, his attachment to his mother, his macabre craftsmanship, and transformed them into cultural archetypes. Ed Gein became less a man and more a symbol, the embodiment of hidden darkness lurking beneath rural normalcy. Plainfield never recovered its innocence. The farmhouse was burned down by locals in 1958 to prevent it from becoming a tourist attraction. Ed's truck, later sold and displayed at carnivals, became an uncomfortable reminder of how quickly crime can be commercialized. For decades, rumors about hidden evidence, including that mysterious object, circulated among residents, historians, and collectors, feeding a folklore that blurred with fact. Today, historians view Ed Gein less as a calculating criminal mastermind and more as a deeply disturbed man whose untreated mental illness and isolation led to unprecedented acts. His story forced communities to confront uncomfortable truths about neglect, silence, and the line between horror and reality. And the object hidden for decades remains a haunting symbol, not because of its physical form, but because of what it revealed about the human mind turned inward too far.